Hi, I'm Rachel Cahill-O'Callaghan, a senior lecturer in Cardiff School of Law and Politics and a member of the Centre of Law and Society here at Cardiff. And my work draws on psychological theory and law to understand the role of values in judicial decision-making. I explore the importance of dissent and difference in the Supreme Court. And we've been asked today to talk about the books we're reading at the moment and why. And the book I want to revisit is a very well-worn copy of Cass Sunstein's Why Society Needs Dissent. The book is published in 2003 and is Sunstein's Oliver Wendell Holmes lectures. Now, my work on judicial decision-making highlights the importance of dissent, and it highlights the importance that difference and dissent play in refining decisions and limiting bias. These are themes that are at the heart of Sunstein's book, and indeed, Sunstein presents a really comprehensive argument that dissent and difference should be treasured in society. But the arrival of COVID-19 has brought my two careers together. I started academic life as a scientist in infectious disease, and the notable increase in people not socially distancing, who this kind of new form of dissent, which has appeared on our streets and in our parks and on our roads, really concerns me. I'm really worried about the second wave of infection and the loss of life that could be associated with it. So I turned back to Sunstein's book because not only does Sunstein highlight the importance of dissent, Sunstein talks at length about the societal and psychological factors that may constrain dissent and promote conformity. And I was wondering, I suppose, inside the pages of this book, whether there was hidden the key to keeping people off the street and perhaps keeping them safely at home. And chapter 2 of this book kind of gives me some insight into perhaps why we're starting to see that increase on the streets. Chapter 2 explores many of the factors that influence the effectiveness of law and context. So the factors that enlist conformity and increase compliance. And it highlights the importance not only of how the law is written, but also how it's communicated. So I have on my computer screen across from me here the restrictions in Wales, so how they were created, the legal structures that were put in place to create the restrictions in Wales. And these are governed by regulations issued by the Welsh Assembly, which is now a parliament, through the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Wales regulation in 2020. And basically, they imposed temporary restrictions on gatherings and movements of people in Wales, and the restrictions are quite clear. It says, during the emergency period, no person may leave the place where they are living or remain away from the place without reasonable excuse. And in paragraph 2b, they provide those reasonable excuses, one of which is to take exercise for no more than once a day. There's no time limit. We're not talking about the hour, just no more than once a day, alone or with family members or with a carer. So we know one of the central elements to compliance and conformity and sticking to the rules is clarity. The rules have to be clear, and there's no uncertainty here. It's clear. It's out once a day on your own. Sunstein also in this chapter highlights the kind of price of non-compliance and suggests perhaps the price of non-compliance should be significant. And here again, maybe the monetary fine isn't sufficient to deter us from all walking around the park together, but surely the consequences of the illness and the serious nature of this illness should be a sufficient deterrent from gathering. So I think what's absolutely central to Sunstein's book, and I think central to this law and context, is that Sunstein argues that non-compliance, that disobedience, is not simply related to how the regulations are written or the punishment we suffer. He argues that compliance and non-compliance is actually a facet of law and society, not the law and the statute books. And central to this is the kind of social influences on our behaviour. So Sunstein's whole book really centres on this idea that the social influences on our behaviour are central to our compliance, but also to our dissent. And one of these factors he discusses in chapter 2 is related to both kind of three different concepts. Our tendency to function as a herd, so our tendency to conformity, visibility and belief. And Sunstein argues that if people believe that disobedience is widespread, they're far more likely to disobey. And from the outset, from the very start of the discussions of compliance and the regulations discussed in the press, we have seen high-profile disobedience. So we've seen the narrative from the press and the newspapers of the dog walkers on the moor, the health advisor in Scotland, and then the latest debacle yesterday with the resignation of Neil Ferguson. The press is replete with high-profile disobedience. Indeed, it's the kind of central narrative. The number of people on the streets, the number of parties, the number of people gathering in the park to play football. The consistent stories of disbelief, perhaps, and disobedience create a kind of a belief, whether that's overt or subconscious, that disobedience has become normal. And Sunstein would argue that high-profile, consistent message that disobedience is normal encourages people to disobey, and disobedience will become the norm. The scientist in me would argue that this has to change, that rather than stories of disobedience, we need to grasp what Sunstein argues at the heart of his chapter 2, that compliance can be increased simply by informing people of the high percentage of people who are already complying. Indeed, he highlights several studies that present this and confirm this assumption that if we tell everybody that everybody is complying, people are far more likely to comply. We have all been told about the number of neighbours that have donated to a charity to encourage our donations, and perhaps it's time to adopt this policy with the COVID message. I wonder, perhaps instead of highlighting dissent as not being treasured, maybe we need to step away from the story of dissent and start to highlight the number of people who are complying with the rules, the number who are staying at home and sticking to the regulations. Maybe, at the moment, even Sunstein would argue, in the context of these regulations, society does not need dissent.